When Katharina Weber, 32, sole heir to an automotive empire worth $400 million, stood in front of the small workshop on the outskirts of Stuttgart in her Ferrari 458 Italia and presented this impossible challenge to 20 mechanics who had disappointed her, no one dared to respond. The car had been to 10 different workshops, from Maranello to Munich, and no certified Ferrari technician had been able to solve the mysterious problem that was preventing the 470 HP V8 engine from functioning properly. But when Thomas Hoffman, a 21-year-old mechanic with oil-smeared hands and a salary of €100 a month, stepped forward and said he could do it in a week, Katharina laughed at his audacity. Katharina laughed at his audacity. What neither of them knew was that this red Ferrari held a secret that would change their lives forever. This workshop on the outskirts of town would become the stage for a discovery that would shake the entire Weber family. And 7 days later, Thomas would not only have repaired this impossible car, but also saved Katharina's father's life without even knowing it. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you were watching this video. The Hoffman workshop was located in an industrial area in Esslingen am Neckar, on the southeastern outskirts of Stuttgart, far away from the shiny showrooms and luxury car dealerships where such vehicles were normally handled. It was a modest hall with brick walls, the floor marked by decades of motor oil, tools on the walls in an order that only Thomas understood. The smell was a mixture of grease, gasoline, and metal, a familiar scent for someone who had grown up among engines and screws. Thomas Hoffman had learned the trade from his father Klaus, an old-school mechanic who believed that cars had souls and that you had to listen to them to understand them. Klaus had died of a heart attack 3 years ago, leaving Thomas the workshop in a mountain of debt. Since then, Thomas had been working 16 hours a day, trying to keep the business going while paying off creditors and looking after his mother, who lived in a small house not far away. He wasn't rich, quite the contrary. He drove a 2000 VW Golf that he had repaired at least a dozen times, lived in a one-room apartment above the workshop where the heating only worked sporadically, and his clothes were always stained with grease, no matter how often he washed them. But he possessed something that money couldn't buy: a natural talent for understanding engines. He could listen to the sound of a key and diagnose the problem before he even opened the hood. His hands, calloused and scarred, could repair anything from old Mercedes to MAN trucks. On that Tuesday morning in November, Thomas was working on a Passat when he heard the unmistakable roar of a Ferrari engine outside. He wiped his hands on a dirty rag and stepped outside, squinting against the pale autumn sun. The Ferrari 458 Italia stood in front of his workshop like a fiery red jewel amid the rust and concrete. It was magnificent. Perfect lines that seemed to have been shaped by the wind itself, polished alloy wheels that reflected the light, cream-colored leather interior visible through the windows. It was worth at least $200,000, maybe more, the kind of car Thomas had only seen in trade magazines. But it wasn't the Ferrari that took his breath away. It was the woman who got out. Katharina Weber was just like she looked on the covers of business magazines. Tall, slim, with long chestnut brown hair tied back in a perfect ponytail. Green eyes that surveyed the world with a mixture of intelligence and suspicion. She wore a red pantsuit that must have cost more than Thomas earned in 3 months, high heels that sounded like hammer blows on the concrete, a Patek Philippe on her wrist, a pearl necklace around her neck that had probably been in her family for generations. She was beautiful, undeniably beautiful, but with the cold, aloof beauty of those who live in another world, made up of board meetings and gala dinners and vernissages to which people like Thomas would never be invited. Behind her, 2 men in dark suits, who must have been bodyguards or assistants, and an older man with a briefcase who looked like a lawyer or advisor, got out. They formed an absurd procession in this suburban workshop, as if the nobility were visiting the common people. Katharina looked around with an expression that wavered between disgust and disbelief. Her eyes slid from the stained floor to the messy tools, from the peeling walls to the small glass-walled office where Thomas had his desk full of unpaid bills. Then her gaze settled on Thomas, and he saw the same expression he had seen 1,000 times before: the automatic contempt of those who always had everything for those who never had anything. But Thomas was used to it. He straightened up, wiped his hands again, even though he knew it was useless, and walked toward her with a firm step. Katharina spoke without preamble, without introduction, as if her time was too precious to waste on pleasantries. She said she had a problem with her Ferrari. It had been to 10 different repair shops, including the most renowned authorized Ferrari centers in Germany. No one had been able to solve it. The engine had an intermittent fault that caused sudden power losses, a strange noise that no one could identify, sensors that went haywire for no apparent reason. The Ferrari technicians in Maranello had replaced half of the engine components without success. The specialists in Munich had rebuilt the entire engine control system. A workshop in Frankfurt had removed and reinstalled the entire fuel system. Nothing had worked. The car continued to cause problems, making it impossible to use it for an important charity race in which she was supposed to drive. And then the challenge came, delivered in that superior tone that made Thomas's blood boil. Katerina said that if he, a mechanic from a rundown workshop, could repair what the best Ferrari mechanics in Germany couldn't, she would hire him immediately in her company with a salary that would solve all his financial problems for the rest of his life. The men in suits laughed. One made a disparaging comment about how impossible it was for an ordinary mechanic to accomplish what experts had failed to do. Katerina herself smiled, but it was a cold smile, the smile of someone who had already decided that she was wasting her time, but wanted to amuse herself by humiliating someone. Thomas should have sent her away, should have said he didn't have time for the whims of the rich who toyed with impossible challenges. But there was something about that car, the way it sat there parked, that called to him. And then there were the debts. His mother who needed medical care he couldn't afford, the repair shop that lost money every month. So Thomas did something that would change everything. He accepted the challenge. The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Katerina stared at him as if trying to figure out whether he was crazy or just stupid. Then she laughed, a crystalline sound but empty of warmth, and said he had 1 week, 7 days, no more. If he failed, he would have to pay the cost of the towing service, plus compensation for lost time. Thomas accepted that too and shook Katerina's hand. Her hand was soft, well manicured, with perfectly painted nails. Thomas's hand was rough, marked by years of work. The contrast was stark. Katerina drove away with her entourage, leaving the Ferrari there like a queen in exile in a kingdom of the poor. Thomas watched her go, then turned to the red car. 7 days to solve a puzzle that had defeated the best. It was impossible, but Thomas Hoffman had always loved impossible challenges. The first 3 days were hellishly frustrating. Thomas took half the Ferrari engine apart, checking every sensor, every cable, every connection. He used all the diagnostic tools he owned and those he could borrow from other mechanics. He ran test after test, searching for that damn intermittent problem that appeared and disappeared without logic. On the 4th day, exhausted and on the verge of despair, Thomas did something no certified Ferrari mechanic would ever do. Instead of relying on technology, he turned off all the computers and listened, really listened, as his father had taught him. Then he heard something, a barely perceptible sound, a rhythmic ticking that made no sense. It came from a part of the engine that theoretically couldn't have any problems. Thomas followed the sound, like Hansel followed the breadcrumbs, until he found what he was looking for, hidden behind the exhaust manifold. Someone had installed a small electronic device connected to the engine management system. It wasn't a Ferrari part, it was something handmade, custom-made, and so well hidden that only someone who knew exactly where to look could find it. The device happened to interfere with the sensors, causing the power losses and malfunctions that had plagued Katerina. But the most disturbing thing was what Thomas found engraved on the surface of the device, the initials FW and a date from 3 months ago. This was not a defect, it was sabotage. Thomas photographed everything with his old phone, then carefully removed the device. He reassembled the engine, ran tests, and for the first time in months, this Ferrari was running perfectly. The roar of the V8 was powerful and clean, without hesitation, without loss of power. It was beautiful. But Thomas had a problem. He had to tell Katerina what he had found, and that meant that someone very close to her car had deliberately sabotaged it. The initials FW tormented him. He knew they had to mean something. Someone in Katerina's circle who had access to the Ferrari. On the evening of the 5th day, he called the number Katerina had left him. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cold and professional. Thomas said, "I've repaired the car," but they needed to talk in person. There was something she needed to know. The next day, Katerina came to the workshop, this time alone. She was wearing jeans and a leather jacket, her hair down, less makeup than usual. She looked younger, more approachable, almost normal, if it weren't for the 10,000 euro watch on her wrist. Thomas showed her the evidence, the device, the photos, the test records. He saw the color drain from Katharina's face as she understood the magnitude of what he was telling her. Someone had sabotaged her car, and the initials FW immediately told her who: Friedrich Weber, her cousin. That evening in Thomas's tiny office, Katharina told a story that should have remained buried in family secrets. Weber Automobile was worth millions. Her father Heinrich had suffered a heart attack 6 months earlier. There was a clause in his will. If Katharina damaged the company's reputation, control would pass to Friedrich, the son of Heinrich's younger brother. Friedrich, 5 years older and convinced he was the natural heir, was furious that Heinrich had chosen Katharina. The Heidelberg Charity Classic was not just a race, it was the stage on which Weber Automobile would be represented in front of the whole of Germany. Do you like this story? Give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. If the Ferrari had problems, it would be a disaster. Friedrich would win. Thomas asked if there had been other acts of sabotage. Katharina admitted to strange problems in the company in recent months. Lost contracts, suppliers withdrawing offers. Nothing provable so far. Going to the police would destroy the family. Heinrich, already fragile, would not be able to cope with his cousins fighting like this. Without harder evidence, Friedrich would deny everything. Thomas had an idea. If Friedrich had sabotaged the Ferrari, he was probably planning something bigger. Katharina looked at him with new eyes, with respect. She had underestimated the garage mechanic. They worked together for the next 2 days. Accustomed to finding hidden problems in engines with his analytical mind, Thomas began to see patterns in financial data. Suspicious transactions, coincidental timing. The discovery made her blood run cold. Friedrich wasn't just sabotaging Katharina, he was slowly poisoning Heinrich Weber. The evidence was hidden in medical bills and forged prescriptions from a private nurse whom Friedrich had insisted on hiring. Thomas discovered through his contacts that the nurse had connections to Friedrich. Katharina obtained medical analyses that showed abnormal medication levels in her father's blood. Not enough for the police yet, but enough to take action. The Heidelberg Charity Classic was in 2 days. Thomas proposed a bold plan. Participate in the race with the perfectly functioning Ferrari. Lull Friedrich into a false sense of security and gather the final evidence in the meantime. They worked around the clock. Thomas not only repaired the Ferrari, but also equipped it with hidden cameras and microphones. Katharina put the nurse under surveillance with the help of a private investigator. Race day dawned with bright sunshine, making the bodies of hundreds of cars on the banks of the Neckar River in Heidelberg gleam. Ferraris, Porsches, Mercedes, and classics, such as BMW 5s and Mercedes 300 SLs. Thousands of spectators crowded around to see the drivers. Many celebrities and industrial magnates were in attendance. Friedrich was there with his Porsche 911 GT3, surrounded by his group of wealthy friends. When he saw Katharina arrive in the perfectly functioning Ferrari, his face contorted into a barely concealed expression of anger. Thomas, wearing a mechanic's overall with the Weber logo, stood by the Ferrari and pretended to make final checks. The race began with the roar of the engines. Katharina drove with millimeter precision. The Ferrari responded perfectly. They drove through the streets of Baden-Württemberg, passing medieval villages. Where people applauded at the roadside, they drove up mountain passes with breathtaking panoramic views, and all the while, hidden cameras and microphones were recording. They recorded Friedrich making an angry phone call, saying that the plan had failed. They recorded him confessing to a friend during a lunch break in Mannheim. He had taken care of his uncle, but it would still take time. But the real bombshell came when Katharina's detective called with urgent news. The nurse had been caught red-handed, adding something to Heinrich's IV at the hospital, where he was undergoing routine checkups. The police had arrested her, and under interrogation, she had confessed everything, naming Friedrich as the instigator. The race ended at sunset with Katharina crossing the finish line to applause. The Ferrari had performed perfectly. Weber Automobiles had cut a fine figure, and the company had raised over €1 million for charity. But while the others celebrated with champagne and selfies, police sirens approached. Friedrich Weber was arrested in front of 300 witnesses, charged with attempted murder and industrial sabotage. The evidence was overwhelming. Heinrich Weber, rescued in time thanks to the intervention, survived and began to recover as soon as the toxic administrations were stopped. He never learned how close he had come to death at the hands of his nephew. And Thomas Hoffman, the mechanic who had taken on an impossible challenge, had not only saved a Ferrari, but also a human life, without even knowing it when he started. The following months saw enormous changes. Friedrich was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Heinrich made a full recovery and took back the reins of Weber Automobiles alongside Katharina, who had proven that she had not only the skills, but also the courage to run the company. And then there was Thomas. Katharina had kept her promise. She offered him a position as technical director of all Weber workshops, with a salary 10 times what he earned in his workshop. But Thomas hesitated. He didn't want everything that had happened between them to be contaminated by money and obligations. He didn't want to be the rescued employee of the rich heiress. He wanted to be her equal, or at least try to be. So he turned down the job, but accepted something else. He proposed a partnership. The Hoffman Workshop would become the specialized, unofficial workshop of Weber Automobiles, responsible for the most complex and delicate repairs, a collaboration between equals, not an employment relationship. Katharina accepted and discovered that she respected Thomas even more for rejecting the easy way out, but there was something deeper growing between them, something that neither of them wanted to admit at first. During the months of investigation and working side by side, Katharina had seen a side of Thomas that challenged all her preconceptions about suburban mechanics: his intelligence, his integrity, the way he cared for his mother with tenderness, the way he talked about engines with a passion she understood because it was the same passion she felt for the family business. And Thomas had seen behind Katharina's cold facade. He had seen a woman who carried the weight of impossible expectations, who fought in a man's world that didn't respect her, who loved her father so much that she risked everything to save him. The first time they kissed was on a February evening after a business meeting that had turned into dinner, which had turned into a walk along the Neckar River in Stuttgart. It was snowing lightly, which was rare for Stuttgart, and the flakes settled on Katharina's hair, making her even more beautiful. Thomas was afraid of not being enough, of not being able to offer her the world she deserved. But Katharina stopped him with a finger on his lips and said something he never forgot. She said she had spent her whole life surrounded by rich men who only wanted her last name and her fortune. Thomas was the first who had really seen her, who had helped her without asking for anything in return, who had risked doing the right thing even though he had nothing to gain. She said that the oil-stained hands he always tried to hide were the most honest hands she had ever held. The following months were not easy. There were social differences, families who didn't understand, Katharina's friends who viewed Thomas with suspicion, workshop customers who made jokes about the mechanic who had taken the boss's daughter, but they persevered. When Heinrich Weber finally met Thomas, he judged him not by his bank account, but by his character. He saw the man who had saved his daughter, and indirectly, him. He invited him to family dinners, asked his opinion on business decisions regarding the workshops, and treated him with a respect Thomas had never experienced from the world of the wealthy. 2 years after that impossible challenge in front of the suburban workshop, Thomas and Katharina were married in a ceremony that united their two worlds. The reception took place in a historic villa on Lake Constance, but the mechanics from the Hoffman Workshop sat at the same table as the board members of Weber Automobile. The menu included both haute cuisine and the spätzle that Thomas's mother prepared every Sunday. The wedding registry suggested donations to a fund that Thomas and Katharina had set up to help young mechanics open their own workshops. Heinrich Weber, fully recovered, led Katharina down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Thomas's mother, wearing a new dress that Katharina had kindly given her, cried with joy at seeing her son so happy. The Hoffman Workshop had become a successful business, specializing in supercars and classic cars, with 5 employees and a 3-month waiting list. Thomas had become a legend in the German automotive world, the mechanic who had solved the impossible and uncovered a criminal conspiracy in the process. But most importantly, He had found love with a woman who had initially looked at him with contempt and now looked at him as if he were the only thing that mattered in the world. Katerina had learned that a person's worth is not measured by the balance in their bank account, but by the size of their heart. She had learned that oil-smeared hands can hold your dreams with more care than perfectly manicured hands. She had learned that true love does not have to be built on foundations of gold, but on foundations of respect, trust, and courage. And Thomas had learned that being a suburban mechanic didn't mean he was less than anyone else. He had learned that talent and integrity open doors that money can't buy. He had learned that an impossible challenge can turn into the greatest blessing of your life if you have the courage to accept it. The Ferrari 458 Italia that had started it all was restored and displayed in the lobby of Weber Automobile headquarters with a plaque telling the story of the mechanic who repaired it when no one else could, saving an empire and finding love in the process. Years later, when journalists asked Katerina what the defining moment in her life had been, she smiled and told them about that Tuesday morning when a red Ferrari pulled up to a rundown suburban garage, and a mechanic with grease-smeared hands had the courage to say yes to an impossible challenge. And when they asked Thomas what this experience had taught him, he replied with the words his father had said to him many years ago, that every broken car hides a story, that you have to have the courage to look for it, and that sometimes repairing an engine means repairing something much more important. The story of the mechanic and the heiress became a legend in the German automotive world. But for Thomas and Katharina, it wasn't a legend. It was simply their life built on a suburban garage, an impossible-to-repair Ferrari, and the courage to look beyond appearances to recognize a person's true value. And that red Ferrari, now gleaming under the spotlights at Weber Automobile headquarters, remained the perfect symbol of their story. Beautiful, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Just like the love that had united two such different worlds into something perfect. If this story makes you believe that true love conquers all differences and that talent is worth more than money, leave a little heart below so I know. And if you really want to support stories like this, which tell of real people with real hearts in a world that too often forgets what really matters, you can leave a heartfelt thank you using the Super Like feature below. Every gesture counts, just like Thomas's gesture when he took on this impossible challenge. Because you decided to stay until the end, and that makes you as special as the protagonist of this story.